You can't just land a helicopter in a residential neighborhood," Karen screeched, her HOA badge flapping as she stormed through the crowd. The wind from the rotors whipped her hair into a tornado of chaos. Behind her, my buddy AJ stepped down from the chopper in full marine dress blues, holding a rack of ribs like the Holy Grail. The kids were cheering. The brass band was playing. And the fire pit that started it all? Roaring proudly, right in the middle of my backyard. Legal, certified, and flaming with justice. Karen had no idea what kind of war she'd started. But then again, she never read the fine print. It all started 6 weeks earlier, on a sunny Saturday morning that smelled like fresh cedar chips and barbecue dreams. I had just finished laying the last stone around my new fire pit, a beauty I built by hand to honor a fallen Marine brother, Dom. It was simple, solid, and respectful, just how we liked things in the Corps. My smoker grill stood tall beside it, already hissing with the promise of brisket. I had country music humming low, a cold drink in my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was home. That's when the SUV pulled up. Black, shiny, and way too clean for a place that prided itself on rustic suburban charm. The door swung open, and out marched Karen. Not a Karen. The Karen. HOA president, self-appointed moral compass, destroyer of joy. She wore a visor that looked like it had been ironed and a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. She didn't smile. Didn't knock. Just walked straight into my yard like it was the set of a reality show where she was both judge and executioner. "Excuse me," she said, staring at the fire pit like it had personally insulted her HOA's ancestors. "That's not allowed." I blinked. "Come again." "Open flames are strictly prohibited by HOA regulations," she said, flipping through pages like she was reading from a holy book. "No fire pits. No smokers. No uncontrolled outdoor fires of any kind." I looked at the pit, then at her, then back at the pit. "It's controlled. I built it with stone, got a fireproof base, even have extinguishers ready." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Doesn't matter. We have rules." I forced a polite smile, but my jaw was already tightening. "I read the bylaws when I bought the house. Didn't see anything about fire pits." She tapped her clipboard. Clause 4B.2, subsection F. "It falls under visual contaminants and hazardous domestic fixtures." Hazardous? I almost laughed. "Lady, I used to lead combat patrols through Kandahar. If you think a backyard fire pit is hazardous, you might be allergic to life." Karen wasn't amused. "You have 48 hours to dismantle it or face daily fines." She spun on her orthopedic sneakers and marched off, leaving the smell of self-righteousness in her wake. I stood there for a moment, stunned. Then I looked at the pit again, at the quiet stone circle that meant more to me than she'd ever understand. That fire pit wasn't just for grilling hot dogs. It was for Dom. Dom had been my closest brother-in-arms. We met in boot camp, served through 2 tours, survived an IED blast together, and shared stories under countless fire pits just like this one. He didn't make it back from the last mission. We lost him to sniper fire on what was supposed to be a routine patrol. The last time we'd talked, he told me, "When we get out of this mess, we're going to build fire pits in our backyards, drink beer, and live like old dogs." It was a promise. One of us kept it. So no, I wasn't about to tear it down because Karen had a vendetta against heat. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat beside the fire, staring at the flames until they blurred. I started reading through the HOA regulations again, this time like it was my mission dossier. And then I found it. Clause 7A.1. Communal cooking installations are permitted for cultural or memorial events with advanced notice and board approval. My jaw dropped. They'd banned fire pits, but left a wide-open loophole for communal cooking installations. That meant anything from a pig roast to a ceremonial torch, as long as it was tied to an event. And no one knew events like the Marines. The next morning, I submitted my formal request to the HOA. A Marine Corps Heritage Cookout, commemorating the legacy and brotherhood of fallen service members. I even attached a menu, a list of attendees, and a tentative schedule that included a flag ceremony and a moment of silence. I may have also used some impressive military acronyms that sounded official but meant absolutely nothing. Karen signed off, probably thinking it was some somber backyard weepfest with folded flags and quiet speeches. She was about to be introduced to the full force of Semper Fi. I called up AJ, my old pilot buddy now working private contract, told him I needed a favor that involved a little airlift and a whole lot of barbecue. His laugh crackled through the phone. You serious? Dead serious. Is this about a girl? Worse. It's about an HOA. He whistled. I'm in. Over the next 2 weeks, I assembled the dream team. Marines from all branches. Some local. Some driving in from out of state. We coordinated logistics like a mission op. Grills were hauled in. Tents set up. A Marine jazz band even volunteered to play. A few of the guys were bringing military vehicles for display. Legal ones, of course. Karen had no idea the scale of what was coming. And thanks to her own signature, she couldn't stop it. The night before the event, I stood in the backyard, admiring what we'd built. The fire pit glowed. The smoker was seasoned and humming. The flags were hung. And in the center of it all was a small plaque with Dom's name on it. I raised my glass and whispered, "Hope you're watching, brother. Tomorrow we bring the fire." The morning after I submitted the event request, I half expected to wake up to Karen banging on my door with a cease and desist notice and 3 new violations for daring to exist. But to my surprise, the HOA emailed back with a bland, bureaucratic event approved pending adherence to community noise ordinances. Karen probably didn't read it closely, or maybe she just assumed a military memorial cookout would be a bunch of old guys eating potato salad in folding chairs while we cried into our camo cap. She had no idea she'd just greenlit the most spectacular suburban cookout this neighborhood, or any HOA board, had ever seen. I wasted no time kicking Operation Smoke Screen into high gear. First thing I did was get in touch with Marty, a retired logistics officer who now ran a barbecue supply company like it was still a combat zone. Within 2 days, my yard turned into a prep site. Brisket, ribs, sausages, and a mountain of wood chips started piling up in my garage. It looked like a Texas roadhouse had exploded inside a military surplus store. My neighbor Greg, a quiet guy who usually kept to himself, peeked over the fence and raised an eyebrow when he saw the growing stack of portable grills and crates of spice rubs. "You opening a restaurant?" he asked. "Nope. Just honoring a friend." Greg gave a slow nod and said nothing else. The next day, he showed up with 2 coolers of homemade beer and a smoker that looked like it had once been welded to a battleship. Apparently, he'd served in the Navy and had a thing for smoked duck. Just like that, another ally was on board. Word started spreading. Marines, veterans, neighbors with nothing better to do, they all wanted in. Some to help. Some just to see what the hell was going on. And once they heard there was going to be a live band and maybe, possibly, a helicopter, they were all in. I made a few more calls, including one to my cousin Mikey, a culinary school dropout turned grill master. He agreed to man the ceremonial smoker and show up in dress blues, even if the only action he'd ever seen was a brisket cook-off in Memphis. Meanwhile, Karen began sniffing around like a bloodhound with a clipboard. She showed up 3 times that week under the pretense of checking for code compliance. I kept things squeaky clean. No open flames yet. Everything was still boxed or covered. She couldn't find anything to write up, which clearly drove her nut. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of my driveway staring at the American flag I'd hoisted on a 20-foot pole. I just waved at her and offered a hot dog from the test batch. She declined. Politely. Barely. 3 days before the event, I held a quick strategy meeting in my garage. It felt a lot like our old mission briefings, just with more folding chairs and fewer rifles. We assigned roles, set up traffic plans for the neighborhood, coordinated cooking stations. I even had a buddy from the sheriff's department agree to swing by in uniform as volunteer security, mostly to keep Karen from inventing new violations during the event. And then there was the helicopter. AJ called to confirm the flight path and landing zone, which was a vacant field just beyond the HOA's designated community garden that no one had used in years except for weeds and the occasional sunburned tomato. It was technically outside HOA jurisdiction, something I triple-checked with county zoning before signing off. Karen couldn't touch it. The plan was simple. AJ would do a low pass during the cookout, hover for a bit, and then land. He'd exit with a rack of ribs and a salute. Aerial delivery, Marine style. The night before the event, Karen tried one last Hail Mary. She came to my door with a stack of papers, some highlighted in neon pink. She didn't knock, just waited like a summoned demon with a stapler. "This has gone far enough," she said, holding up the printouts like they were holy scriptures. "We're hearing chatter that this is not a simple cookout. I've received multiple reports that this will involve aircraft." "You mean the helicopter?" Her eye twitched. "There will be no helicopters in this community." "Oh, no worries," I said. "It's landing just outside the property line. Totally legal. I checked with the FAA and the county. You know, chain of command and all that." Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. "This is an abuse of your event permit. Actually, it's a memorial tribute. Fully compliant under Clause 7A.1. You signed it yourself." She sputtered, flipping through her copies, probably realizing she had in fact initialed the approval without understanding what she'd greenlit. She tried to pivot. "You're turning this into a circus. There are families here. Children." "There'll be bounce houses," I replied. "And free lemonade." She stared at me like she was trying to ignite me with her thoughts. "I'll be watching," she said, voice low and ominous. I nodded. "You always are." When she left, I gathered the last of the prep crew and gave a final run-through. Everything was ready. The fire pit was clean and primed. The grills were lined up like artillery. We had canopies, flags, and enough meat to feed a battalion. My buddy Kyle, a former supply sergeant, had even brought in a commercial-grade cooler rigged to play Marine Corps marches every time someone opened the lid. It was dumb. It was perfect. At sunrise the next morning, I stood on my back porch drinking coffee, watching the yard slowly fill with people. Marines in uniform. Families with lawn chairs. Veterans in jackets with patches from every campaign since Desert Storm. Some saluted the flag as they entered. Some went straight for the ribs. I let the fire pit blaze for the first time, lighting it with Dom's old Zippo, the one he'd used back in Fallujah. The smoke curled into the sky like a signal. The cookout had officially begun. By noon, we were at full capacity. The band was playing. The grills were smoking. Kids were laughing as they ran between tents. Every corner of the yard had someone telling a story, hugging an old friend, or just eating like it was the Last Supper. And right in the middle of it all, Karen stood on the curb with two HOA board members, both looking like they wanted to melt into the sidewalk. She held her clipboard like a shield, scanning for violations, but everything was clean, legal, untouchable. I walked over, handed her a pulled pork sandwich on a biodegradable plate, and said, "You might want to eat fast." She looked at me confused. "Why?" And then it happened. The rumble started soft, just a hum in the distance. People paused, shielding their eyes from the sun. A moment later, the thump-thump-thump of rotor blades rolled through the air like an approaching storm. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The helicopter crested the hill and hovered just above the field. The wind kicked up. Flags flapped. Paper plates flew. Karen's visor launched off her head like it had been fired from a cannon. AJ descended, slow and dramatic, the door sliding open midair. He jumped out with the ribs in hand, saluted, and walked toward the yard like he'd just dropped into a combat zone. The crowd erupted. The brass band switched to the Marines hymn. People started chanting USA. Karen turned the color of unseasoned oatmeal. And that's when I knew she'd lost. And we were just getting started. The moment AJ stepped out of the helicopter, it was like someone detonated a freedom grenade in the middle of suburbia. The crowd went wild, cheers, applause, some people even saluting instinctively. The kids sprinted toward the fence line, eyes wide and mouths open, like Santa had just flown in wearing aviators and dress blues. AJ, unfazed by the chaos, strolled up with the confidence of a man who knew he had just executed the single most over-the-top barbecue entrance in HOA history. He handed me the ribs like we were in the middle of a classified meat drop, nodded once and said, "Package delivered." The helicopter slowly ascended behind him, climbing back toward the clouds, its rotors still whipping the air into a frenzy. Napkins, hats, and the occasional plastic fork took flight, spinning through the sky like celebratory confetti. Karen stood across the yard, paralyzed in disbelief, one hand clutching her now empty clipboard and the other trying to hold down what remained of her hairstyle. Her jaw moved like she was forming words, but nothing came out. It was as if her entire understanding of HOA power had just been rendered obsolete by smoke, laughter, and smoked brisket. But if she thought that was the peak of the day, she had no idea what else was coming. The Marine Brass Band launched into a patriotic medley, seamlessly blending into an acoustic rendition of "Proud to be an American" that had three old guys crying into their potato salad. Veterans stood in circles, swapping stories over grilled sausage links and smoked duck. Mikey, wearing a chef's apron over his uniform, worked the main smoker like he was competing for a Michelin star, barking orders at anyone who got within 5 feet of his ribs. Greg's homemade beer flowed like it was being piped directly from Valhalla. Neighbors who'd never spoken before were suddenly best friends. Kids learned how to fold flags properly. Wives of veterans traded deployment stories and exchanged phone numbers. And in the middle of all that beautiful chaos, Karen was the only one who looked like she was actively melting. She tried to talk to a few board members, pointing and gesturing wildly, but they avoided her like she was radioactive. It was clear the tide had turned. No one wanted to get caught in her anti-helicopter crossfire. Around 3 p.m., I gathered everyone near the fire pit for the tribute portion of the cookout. The band went quiet. Conversations died down. People formed a respectful semicircle as I stepped forward with Dom's photo in my hand. The fire behind me crackled softly. I cleared my throat and looked out at a sea of faces, some old, some young, all united in a single moment of understanding. Dom was the kind of Marine who could make you laugh even in a firefight, I said, my voice steady but tight. He believed in 3 things: duty, brotherhood, and that ribs should be smoked low and slow for at least 6 hours. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. We lost him on a mission that was supposed to be boring. But Dom never did anything halfway. Not war. Not life. And not friendship. So when I got back, I promised him I'd build a fire pit and share it with people who knew what that fire really meant. I paused, letting the words sit in the quiet. Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, visibly uncomfortable. I ignored her. This fire isn't just for cooking. It's for remembering. For laughing. For healing. And yeah, maybe for roasting the occasional marshmallow with way too much bourbon. Laughter broke the tension again, but it was warm, full of understanding. Then I nodded to AJ, who stepped forward with a folded flag. Together, we mounted it on the pole beside the pit. A trumpet player stepped forward and began playing tap. No one moved. Even the children stayed still. The flame flickered in sync with the music, casting long shadows as the sun began to dip behind the trees. It was simple. It was solemn. And it was exactly what Dom would have wanted. When the last note faded, silence held for a beat. Then came the applause. Not loud or rowdy, but steady and full of respect. I looked over and, to my surprise, saw even a couple of board members wiping their eyes. Karen, however, was unmoved. She marched away mid-clap, disappearing behind a row of hedges like a villain retreating into a shrubbery fortress. With the formalities done, The party picked back up like someone hit the resume button on Joy. The band kicked into some blues rock, people lined up again for seconds, and someone even broke out a cornhole set. It was like the entire neighborhood had collectively decided to forget the HOA even existed. The difference in atmosphere was incredible. For one afternoon, nobody cared about fence heights, grass lengths, or mailbox colors. They cared about community, family, and freedom, and maybe who had the best coleslaw. Later in the evening, I noticed a few folks wandering over to the edge of the lot, phones out, pointing at the landing field. Apparently, the chopper return for pickup had become the neighborhood's main event. AJ had said he'd be back just before sunset to retrieve the grillmaster, which meant Karen's internal meltdown was going to have a sequel. She didn't disappoint. About 30 minutes before AJ's return, Karen reemerged, now wearing a high-vis vest and carrying a walkie-talkie, clearly in full neighborhood safety captain mode. She stormed up to me with a man I didn't recognize, a younger guy in a county fire department polo and an expression that screamed, "I don't want to be here." "This is Fire Marshal Jensen," Karen declared. "He's here to inspect your illegal fire pit and shut this entire operation down." The crowd around us quieted slightly. I looked at Jensen, gave him a friendly nod. "Afternoon. Want a plate of ribs while you do it?" He looked at the pit, then at me, then at the well-labeled extinguishers, the neat fire break line, the overhead permit documents laminated and hanging from a post. He blinked. "This is one of the safest outdoor cooking setups I've ever seen." Karen turned crimson. "But the helicopter, the noise, the safety hazards, you're going to let this continue?" Jensen shrugged. "FAA cleared the flight. County cleared the field. And everything else is well within safety code." I smiled and handed him a water bottle. "Told you, Karen." Dotting I's and crossing T's since boot camp. The crowd nearby started clapping again, this time not for a song, but for the sheer beauty of watching bureaucracy collapse under the weight of competence. Karen backed away, muttering something about filing a formal complaint, but it was clear even she knew the walls were closing in. Whatever power she'd thought she had, it had just gone up in a glorious puff of barbecue smoke. And then, right on cue, the chopper returned. Low and majestic, silhouetted by the setting sun, it hovered briefly before touching down with cinematic grace. This time, AJ stepped out with a salute and a toothpick in his mouth, looked around and yelled, "All right, who wants a ride?" And for a split second, even Karen looked tempted. The Monday after the cookout, it was like the neighborhood had experienced a collective awakening. People who once barely waved at each other were now stopping to chat on morning walks, swapping recipes from the cookout, and even coordinating their own mini-gatherings. Greg told me someone down the street was planning a jazz brunch, and Mrs. Nguyen, who hadn't spoken to a neighbor in 3 years, had apparently baked 4 pies and hand-delivered them door to door. It was like the fire pit had ignited something deeper than charcoal, it lit up the entire sense of community. But there was one person who did not share in the new spirit of unity, Karen. While everyone else was basking in the glow of post-cookout camaraderie, Karen was stewing. On Tuesday morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped with the HOA logo. Inside were no fewer than 10 separate violation notices. Each one typed, printed, and signed in a pen that looked like it had been dipped in venom. The list of infractions was absurd. Excessive flag display. Unauthorized temporary structures. Non-standard sound amplification. Improper footwear on lawn during event. Even unpermitted meat-based smoke dispersal was listed. I stood there on my porch laughing so hard I nearly dropped the stack. That afternoon, a few other neighbors came by holding similar envelope. Karen, apparently enraged by her public defeat, had retaliated by mass-issuing violations to anyone who had attended the cookout or even parked nearby. Some folks were hit for things like grass disturbance and improper beverage disposal. The worst part? The fines weren't just symbolic. She had tacked on real dollar amounts, $50 here, $75 there, adding up to hundreds for some of the families. It was petty. It was desperate. And it was exactly the kind of thing she was known for when she felt her grip slipping. I could have laughed it off. I really could have. But the fact that she targeted my neighbors, good people who had just experienced a taste of actual community, pushed me past the point of tolerance. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had declared war on everyone, and it was time to fight back. Not with fists, but with firepower of the bureaucratic kind. The first thing I did was contact my lawyer, an old Marine who now specialized in property and HOA law. His name was Brick, and yes, that was his real name. Brick had the kind of voice that sounded like it had been carved from gravel and aged in oak barrels. When I told him what was going on, he didn't even hesitate. "She messed with the wrong devil dog," he growled. "Send me the documents. I'll bury her in paperwork." While Brick assembled our counteroffensive, I got to work on the neighborhood front. We called a meeting, no HOA approval needed, at Greg's garage. 22 people showed up, folding chairs in hand, along with cookies, iced tea, and a burning desire for change. One by one, neighbors shared their Karen horror stories. Fines for flower colors, notices for holiday decorations. Even a couple who got cited for using the wrong type of mulch. The room buzzed with frustration, but also a strange excitement. For the first time, they weren't just victims of HOA tyranny. They were an organized unit. We decided then and there to push for a vote of no confidence. According to the HOA bylaws, which, by this point, I had practically memorized, a board president could be removed with a 2/3 majority of homeowners present at a special meeting. We set a date, printed flyers, and knocked on doors. People were eager to sign. Some were giddy. It was like watching the opening scene of a suburban rebellion movie where the soccer moms rise up with spreadsheets and revenge in their eyes. Karen must have caught wind of it, because 2 days before the scheduled vote, she filed an injunction with the county claiming that I had hosted a paramilitary demonstration and endangered public safety. The document was laughably dramatic. It included still frames from the helicopter landing, a screen grab of AJ saluting, and even a photo of the ribs labeled, "Possible Incendiary Cooking Item." But what really got me was her claim that the event had triggered her PTSD from a past experience involving unexpected poultry at a neighborhood potluck. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The court date was set quickly, probably because even the judge wanted to see how ridiculous this would get. I showed up in a clean suit, Brick by my side, and a binder of every permit, approval email, and legal zoning document we had. Karen arrived with a wheeled suitcase full of laminated photos, diagrams, and what looked like at least 3 color-coded charts. She brought no lawyer, just herself and an attitude that could curdle milk. The courtroom was small, with maybe a dozen people in the gallery, half of them neighbors who'd come to support me. Karen opened with a speech that sounded like she was auditioning for a legal drama on cable TV. She talked about infiltration, unauthorized aerial activity, and militarized meats. The judge listened, deadpan, until she started comparing my fire pit to a live artillery range. That's when he held up a hand and said, "Ma'am, do you have any actual evidence that this man violated the law?" Karen sputtered. "The helicopter, the fire, the band, the community joy. It was a breach of protocol." Brick stood up, calm as a still pond. "Your Honor, every part of the event was approved under the HOA's own guidelines, signed by the complainant. The helicopter was cleared by the FAA and landed off property. The fire pit meets every code requirement. My client is a decorated veteran. This wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a cookout." The judge turned to Karen. "You filed this injunction without cause. I'm dismissing it with prejudice, and you may want to consider reviewing your own HOA's bylaws before wasting the court's time again." Karen turned a shade of purple I didn't know skin could achieve. She stormed out, leaving her suitcase of nonsense behind. One of the neighbors who'd come to support me leaned over and whispered, That's the first time I've seen her retreat. With the case dismissed, we returned to the neighborhood with more momentum than ever. The day of the no-confidence vote came, and people showed up in droves. They wore red, white, and blue. They brought kids, snacks, and folding chairs. It felt less like a vote and more like a 4th of July celebration, minus the fireworks and with way more passive-aggressive energy. We hit quorum within the first 15 minutes. When the ballots were counted, the results were overwhelming. 84% voted to remove Karen as HOA president. She wasn't even present. She'd locked herself in her house and drawn the blinds. An hour later, the new board was announced, led by none other than Greg, our once quiet neighbor turned unexpected local hero. The crowd erupted. Someone popped open champagne. Someone else started chanting, and before I knew it, people were hugging and clapping like it was New Year's Eve. Karen's reign was over. And the fire pit? Still standing. Still burning. The week after Karen's removal felt like we'd stepped into a parallel universe, one where neighbors smiled without suspicion, lawn decor was no longer policed like contraband, and the words community regulation no longer made anyone's eye twitch. People began leaving their porch lights on later, hosting spontaneous driveway hangouts, and even sharing tools and garden produce like it was 1963. The fire pit, once the battlefield of suburban defiance, had quietly transformed into a neighborhood monument, an unspoken reminder of what we'd endured and what we'd overcome. And while Karen had retreated into her fortress of window blinds and bitter glares, the rest of us were building something far more powerful than any policy: actual trust. It didn't take long for Greg and the newly elected HOA board to get to work cleaning up the mess. The first order of business was to review and revise the bylaws. Line by line, clause by outdated clause. They invited the entire neighborhood to participate, hosting open meetings at the community center and even my backyard once, with hot dogs and fold-out tables. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very place that nearly got me fined into oblivion was now a gathering ground for rewriting the rules. And not just the ones about fire pits. People suggested more reasonable noise ordinances, flexible decor guidelines, seasonal event permissions, and a clause that explicitly protected veterans' commemorative displays. By the time we were done, the new bylaws read like they were written by people who actually lived there, not a committee of control freaks on a power trip. But the fire pit wasn't just symbolic. It was still very much functional, and it had more work to do. With the dust settled, I decided to host one final cookout. Not a protest, not a spectacle, just a good old-fashioned thank you party. No helicopter. No uniforms. Just good food, good music, and a celebration of what a real neighborhood should feel like. The invites went out by word of mouth and group text, but by Saturday afternoon, my backyard was packed again. Old faces, new friends, kids who now called my smoker the dragon, like it was some mythical beast. Even the band came back, this time with acoustic guitars and harmonicas instead of brass. It felt organic. It felt earned. Around dusk, I saw Greg walking over with a large rectangular object wrapped in cloth. A few people followed behind him, whispering and nudging each other. I stood up from the smoker and met him halfway. He grinned and motioned toward the covered item. "We got you something," he said. "You didn't have to," I replied, already wary of surprises. He laughed. "You might want to let us finish before objecting this time." With a dramatic flair that would have made Karen faint, he pulled back the cloth to reveal a steel plaque mounted on a heavy oak base. The inscription was simple but hit me like a brick wall. "In memory of those who served and those who stood with them. Dedicated to Dom. Let no fire be extinguished by fear." For a long second I couldn't say a word. I looked around at the crowd. Some smiled, some nodded, a few wiped their eyes. Greg placed the plaque near the fire pit, and I just stood there, trying to keep the lump in my throat from giving me away. This wasn't just for me. This was for every vet who'd ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. For every neighbor who'd ever felt bullied by a rulebook written in arrogance. For every moment when fire and food brought people together despite everything working to keep them apart. Thanks, I finally said, voice low and cracking. He would have liked this. The applause came soft and honest. No shouting. No chants. Just people clapping because something right had been done. After that, things eased into a mellow kind of happiness. The kids made s'mores. The grown-ups passed around homemade pie. Someone brought out a guitar and started playing old country ballads under the string lights we'd hung across the fence. No one was checking the time. No one worried about code violations. It was a freedom most people don't realize they're missing until they finally have it. At one point during the evening, I noticed movement near the far side of the fence, behind a line of hedges that separated my lot from Karen's property. She hadn't been seen much since the vote, just occasional glimpses of her peeking through curtains like a retired spy. But now she was outside, standing just at the edge, watching the scene unfold. She didn't say anything. Just stood there, hands clasped, face unreadable. For a moment I considered walking over. Maybe even offering her a plate. But I decided against it. Some people need more time. Some never come around. And some just need to see what community looks like when they're not trying to control it. Karen eventually turned and disappeared back into the shadows of her yard, the faint clink of her gate closing behind her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just a strange kind of closure, like a chapter ending not with fireworks, but with a door gently shutting. The neighborhood would go on. We would go on. With or without her. As the night drew on, the crowd thinned, the fire burned low, and the music faded into quiet conversation. I sat by the pit with AJ and Greg, sipping from a mason jar and watching the last embers glow. The plaque caught the light just enough to make the words shimmer. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Not just peace, not just belonging, but purpose, simple, grounded, and absolutely earned. We did all right, AJ said, nudging me. We did better than all right, I replied. And we sat there, three guys, no titles, no missions, no forms to sign. Just a fire, a plaque, and the unmistakable hum of a neighborhood that had learned to stop surviving its rules and start living through its people. That fire pit may have started as a tribute, a loophole, even a weapon in a suburban standoff. But in the end, it became what it was always meant to be. Home.